Hey everybody, you're watching our first ever WWGOA live streaming event. My name's Bailey, I'm moderating tonight. We're here with George Vondriska, managing editor. Hey George.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm really good. I hope the questions are pouring in.
Yes, they are. So all week we have been asking for your questions. We have a huge list of questions. We're going to try to get to as many as we can tonight. George is going to be answering your questions. But we may not get to all of them. So check out the website. We're going to be posting some answers there. Does that sound good, George?
Yeah, I think that's the plan. Because we had,
okay.
What, Bailey, we had over 100 questions came in ahead of time, right? So we can't answer 100 questions in an hour. So yeah, we're going to do what we can.
Yep. And just a reminder to everyone viewing in tonight, down below you'll see a comment section just like on YouTube. You can actually type in some questions there too. We're going to keep an eye on that, and we'll be throwing some to George, and hopefully he'll be able to answer some of those too. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Well, let's dive in here. George, I have a first question for you. This one is from one of our WWGOA members named Daryl. He says, George, I'm planning on building a planer sled as seen on WWGOA. It uses a planer bit and a router that slides on two parallel 2x6 boards mounted on each side of a table that allows the router sled to stay perfectly level to cut the high spots off from the twisted, cupped, or bowed pieces that need one level and flat surface before running it through a planer. His question is, he's heard from various submitters that if you just run the board or plank through a planer and turn it off after every pass through the planer, can you eventually get that flat surface? Is that correct?
Okay, so here's a couple things. First, I do have to introduce Ginny, my daughter. She's been helping out here in the shop for a couple months, and she's going to help us tonight. In big picture, here's what's going on. We took a bunch of these submitted questions, and I prepped some stuff to make sure I'd be able to answer those questions on the fly as you folks put questions into the comments. Ginny's going to help pull stuff together, and we're going to answer those as much as we can. So the first thing, Ginny, we got to go this way. Krista's on the other side of the camera, and she's going to do her best to keep up with where we're going here and show us what we need to see. So what we need to see now, Krista, is this sled, because this is what he's asking about. Are we there, Krista? You got it? Okay. So the deal with this sled is that it wouldn't go down a hill with this. That's a great point. This is more for flattening wood than going downhill. And if Ginny moves the router back and forth, you can see that it's a little bit like a cross between a radial arm saw and a planer. The idea with this is, all right, if you hold that for a moment, I want to tip this up so everybody can see what's happening. Your material would go in here. This track goes on top. The router rides back and forth, and then pick up the router, Ginny, would you, and show them a bit. There's a really large diameter cutter in there, so that's going to allow you to flatten whatever has been confined in the base of this thing. I've used this to flatten big chunks of material that are too wide for my planer. I've used it to clean up end grain cutting boards. This is on one of our DVDs. So this will certainly get material flat. Once it sits in here, might take some shims under it in order to get it to stop rocking and rolling. That locks it in place. Router slides back and forth, because as Ginny's moving it this way, she's also sliding this track down the jig, and that's how the flattening happens. Now, the planer question. If I understand this right, the question is, if I send stuff through the planer, make a cut, flip it, make a cut, flip it, will it eventually come out flat? Sort of. There's some it depends. So now we got to go this way, Krista. And this is this kind of hard camera shot I'm going to ask Krista to get. We're going to take advantage of the really shiny bed on the planer. So if you could point down this way, Krista, and see if it'll reflect. Jenny, can you just raise the head of the planer, which is that way? Oh, other way, sorry, I misdirected you. All right, so the reason I want to do this is that if you can see in the reflection, how does that look for you, Krista? All right.
Yeah, good.
There's rollers in the planer, and of course it's unplugged, so I can do this. So those rollers are what grab your material and feed it through in order for the you can be done now, Gene. It's a good workout, though. In order for those to be able to feed your material, they've got to have some down pressure. Now, realistically, if we put a board in there that's 2 inches thick and 8 inches wide and it's got a cup in it, those rollers are probably not going to put enough down pressure on it to flatten it, plane it, and have it spring back up on the other side. I think you could go ahead and back out, Krista. However, if the board is thin, let's say it's 3/4 of an inch or less, depending too on how much pressure you put on from the planer, it's possible that you got a cup. You start with a cup, the rollers flatten it, make it smooth, and then basically when it comes out the backside, you have a smooth cup, but you still have a cup. So my point is, on a really thick board, I think planers can take out a cup. On a thin board, they're probably going to push it flat, and it's going to spring back up. A twist, like a big long screw thread, is a whole different deal because it's really hard for the planer to flatten a twist out, so that's not going to be a good solution for you. Do you think that answered the question? As far as you know? Sounds good to Ginny. All right, Bailey, I think we're ready to move on to another one.
That sounds good. Thanks, George. So just to kind of recap, if anyone's just tuned in with us, we are streaming live right now. We are with Managing Editor of Woodworkers Guild of America, George Vondriska, and he is answering all of your woodworking questions tonight. So our next question is from Alvin. Alvin says, I plan on making a mobile 2-foot by 6-foot workbench and have read floor locks should be used to keep it immobile enough to work on. Do you agree?
All right, good question, Alvin. So my deal in my shop, everything has always been on a mobile base. So this time, Krista, we're going to challenge you by going down toward the floor. Give us a roll there, Ginny, on the bench. For me, it's very important that I have mobility. I guess I changed my mind a lot about where I want stuff to be. I'm a one-man show, so when I need to move it, I want to be able to move it. So this is my main workbench. This is the one I use all the time. And to answer your question, yes, I have casters. They're locking casters. Now, if you look at these, and is this where we are, Krista? Are we framed kind of on the roller there?
Yeah.
Okay. These are not your everyday casters. What happens when I lock this, it locks the wheel, which all casters are going to do, but it also locks the pivot mechanism. You probably won't find casters like this at a big box store, but you will find them at woodworking specialty stores. Excuse me. The benefit to that is that it really helps take the wiggle out of the bench when you need to lock it. Now, one step further, the reason that the bolt is in here is that if I really need to stabilize the workbench, like when one of the hand tool guys, which isn't me, but Seth Keller, Dave McKintrick, Tom Casper, or other editors, are here doing video and they're doing hand tool work, we back off the bolt. That allows the bench to go right down to the floor. Then it really locks it in solid. So, casters, yes, they might be able to take the whole total weight of your bench. Now remember, if your bench weighs 500 pounds, each caster only has to be able to take how much?
I'm bad at math.
A quarter of 500, which is 125 pounds. So that would be the load rating per caster. All right, Bailey, what's next?
Awesome. Our next question is from Bruce. He says, what is the best way to avoid getting glue squeeze out into the pores of the wood and messing up the finish on a project?
Okay, we're going to do this one. We need the rosin paper receivable plate. We're going to set this one up, and then we're going to come back to it as time goes on. So we can spread that out. And if you flip it over and it curls the other way, it'll stay. While we're done. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to glue some boards together. Doctor? All right. My approach to squeeze out is to leave it alone. One thing I can tell you is that it's pretty uncommon for me to go after squeeze out with a damp rag. My feeling is that that does a good job of further diluting the glue and pushing it into the pores. So What I'm going to do is we're going to get these boards set up to glue edge to edge. We're going to get a bead of glue that's going to come out of there, and then I'll talk about where we're going with that next. All right, Jenny, go ahead and close this up on the inside. Yep, other way. And you got to kind of, there, now we'll go. All right, we have a beautiful glue bead on top of those boards. Don't touch it. What we're going to do is we're going to come back to this in a little bit. I'm going to check the clock. In 10 or 15 minutes, that glue is going to be just the right consistency. What I'm looking for is a point where the glue is kind of rubbery. And at that stage of the game, we'll be able to slice it off of there with one of my glue chisels. We'll talk about that when we get to it. So don't let me forget. In about 10 or 15 minutes, we've got to revisit this.
Okay.
I mean, in a little bit. And that's the approach I use, whether I'm gluing up jewelry boxes or legs and rails on tables, or anytime I have squeeze out, this is probably going to be what I do. And we'll come back and look at that, the effect of that in just a little bit. All right, Bailey.
That sounds good. Just to check in real quick, we are live with Woodworkers Guild of America Managing Editor George Vondriska. He's answering all of your woodworking questions tonight. So if you have a question, just post it right down below in the comments and we'll try to get to it. Our next comment or question comes from John. He has a question about using the jointer. When running a board through the jointer and say you want to reduce the width by say 1/16 of an inch, what does each pass take, why does each pass take off more material on one end than the other?
All right, we're going to make a move here. Heading for the joiner. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, so just stay back. This one we don't need to be tight on. We need a big picture on this one. Yeah, good question. What we're looking at here is setup on the machine. One thing you want to check is to make sure that the in-feed and the out-feed tables are level. Jenny, could you grab that 4-foot level that's hanging on the pegboard right there, way on the right side? So we'll have a look at checking those beds for level. I'll show you how. So we're going to take a straight edge, thank you. With the joiner unplugged, I'm going to hold it tight onto the out-feed table. And then what we'd be looking at is the gap between the bottom of the level and the top of the table at both ends here. We want to make sure that that gap is the same. That would tell us that the beds are parallel to each other. What can happen is, the way you can measure this is using if not, you're going to have to look at the manual and see what you need to do in order to fix that. The other thing I found from watching students in classes is that what can happen is just your hand pressure can have an effect on this. So as I'm feeding this board, if I have a lot of down pressure on my left hand and very little down pressure on my right hand, what will happen is I will take more off the leading edge of the board. It seems weird. It seems like we should be able to just feed the board and it's going to do the same thing throughout. But you do have to have uniform pressure between your hands, front and back, to make sure that you get a good pass. Now, while we're here at the joiner, I'm going to give you a freebie. And Krista, could you throw me a heavy pencil off of that workbench right there? Yep. Thank you. Yeah. All right. All right. Because another thing we should talk about here at the joiner is feed direction. This is really important. On a lot of materials, this is red oak. There's these heavy grain patterns like this. And one of the things that grain pattern tells me is that the grain here, now you might want to, or I can walk toward you, that might be easier. Here at the edge of the board, how's that look? Right here. Okay. The grain is prevailing down toward this edge. And what I always say is, think of the grain like hairs on a cat. And if we look at it this way, and these are hairs on a cat, Jenny, which way do cats like their hair brushed?
Probably with the fur.
With the fur, very good. So this board, this cat wants to get it wants to be petted in this direction, so that the grain, the cat hairs, lay down, not get lifted up. The way that affects us with the joiner then is that the joiner head is spinning like this this would be the correct feed direction on the joiner, so the cat hairs lay down. If we go the wrong way, and imagine this pencil is one of the cat hairs, it's going to stand up on end, and the symptom of that is that we get little chips in the edge of the board. And this is a case where you don't want to let the chips fall where they may. So the really good news out of this whole thing is that typically, if you have a flame pattern like this, it points in the correct direction of feed. If you get an edge like this one up here, let me come in again, where it's really, really, really straight, that doesn't matter which way you feed. You can go either way when it's really straight like that. All right, Bailey, hit me.
All right, our next question is from David. He has a woodworking shop in his basement, and he says his biggest problem is noise. How can he dampen the noise from going up into the house?
Well, I don't understand why the people upstairs don't want to hear the plane or the table saw and the router run. So maybe they need to move out. Maybe that's, okay, that's not a good answer. All right, here's the deal with sound insulation. This is going to be a visual answer. Can you get the whiteboard, please? For this, what we used to do when I was still in building construction, and we were building especially like commercial buildings, apartment buildings and that kind of stuff, part of the deal for sound insulation is putting fiberglass insulation in the stud pockets. So if you're in a basement and you've got ceiling joists and you want to separate the basement from the upstairs, put fiberglass insulation in there, and that's going to help a lot. But the other problem is that we take really dense material, drywall, we put it right on the bottom of the floor joist. On top of the floor joist, you've got subfloor and then a floor. And so we're transmitting the sound, drywall, joist, subfloor, upstairs, everybody can hear it. So one thing we used to do is use a product called Built Right or Celotex. It's a very dark, fibrous material, and that would go on a ceiling or a wall first, then covered with drywall. It's a 1/2 inch thick. So you need to know you're going to do it when you put your fixtures in. And that would then insulate or dampen the vibration that's going from the drywall to the joist up into the upstairs. That's one solution. Another way to do it is to get the drywall to stand off. If you look on the worldwide interweb for soundproofing track, what you'll find is that if these are our floor joists, you can get tracks that'll then typically run the other way, and in profile they might look something like that. This gets fastened here, the drywall then gets fastened to that. Concept is the same. We're taking that really, really, really dense drywall and we're separating it from the ceiling joist by having those tracks in there so that it dampens the vibration.
I think maybe we should sign up an art class next.
I know we should have you do the drawing while I do the talking because you're way better at it. All right, Bailey.
Pretty good artwork there, George.
Thank you, CJ.
All right, our next question is from Tom. He says, I noticed in one of your videos that you use the Trend Air Pro. I am told that the battery, when fully charged, will run down by itself in a few days and possibly have an hour or so left when you go to use it. This would not work well for me because I only woodwork every few days. Do you find this to be true?
All right, Jenny is getting the Trend Air Pro right behind the grinder in the plastic bag. Because I forgot to bring that forward earlier. You could even put it on and show people. So the deal with this thing, it's pretty cool. It's got a face shield on it. So that, of course, if I'm turning or doing any work in the shop, is protecting me. And then there's also a battery-driven air system and filter. What that's doing right now is it's drawing air in through a filtration system, pushing it down over Ginny's face. Really nice when I'm turning. I wear this all the time. So to answer your question, in my case, I haven't found that. Now, for me, what usually happens is I charge this. We come into a video shoot or a bowl turning, and I would say I'm good for 3 or 4 hours of wearing this and having it run. Then maybe while I'm having lunch, I'll plug it back in, we'll get a charge back on it, then I'm back to work in the afternoon. So in my case, I haven't experienced any kind of premature battery failure, what I would do is maybe contact Trend and say, what is the expected life? How long can I expect this thing to run? And there shouldn't be a lot of variable there because it's a single speed unit. It's either on or off. So I'm sure they have a runtime. And then once you have a unit of your own, if it's not matching those expectations, you can give them a call again and find out what the dealio is with the battery. Thanks, Eddie. All right, Bailey.
All right, this next one is from Jim. He's just got a real quick question for you. He says, how can I cut a 19-inch circle to mount a round stained glass window?
Okay, 19-inch circle for a round stained glass window. Let's come back, before we do that, let's come back to glue world. Can you come in on this a little bit, Kristen?
Mm-hmm.
So this is, and then down to the glue?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is close. Now, what I'm looking at is here in the center, it's turned a pretty dark yellow, but out here, it's still a little bit too liquidy. See how yellowy this is? So in the middle, it's probably ready to do our cut on, but out here on the edges, I think if we do it right now, it's going to be, well, let's give it a try. Let's see if that cuts for me. Oh yeah, that's pretty good. And see how that peels and it doesn't leave any residue behind? Now, if it's too wet, the problem will be that when we hit that bubble, we're going to burst it like a glue blister, and then we're going to end up with glue all over the surface. That's going to be a big mess. So we really wanted it a consistency where it cuts but doesn't pop. Now, if you wait too long, it's going to get too hard. You're not going to be able to cut it loose. Let's talk about the chisel for a sec. Are we there? Okay. So this is not one of my joinery chisels. This is a chisel I only use for glue and stuff like this. I sharpened it on a belt sander, not on a whetstone, and that's all the edge we need on here to slice that glue off. And like I said earlier, when it comes to removing glue, inside corner on a jewelry box, inside corner between a furniture leg and a furniture rail, this is the same approach I'm going to use to slice that glue off real carefully instead of wiping it. I find this works really, really, really well.
George, and that doesn't affect the finish at all?
Well, so that's what we're after here is we're trying to get this to where the glue, you can back out. We want to get this to where we don't allow the glue the opportunity to get into the surface. So in this case, where we're cutting it away, a little bit of sanding afterward, and whatever tiny bit of glue residue is left is going to be gone. And I find this to be a really good way to take care of the glue and the surface problem. If we don't do this, if we're not careful, then we find out that we messed up with the glue when we go to put finish on. Stain and top coats won't stick where you have glue because you've basically pre-finished them already. So we've got to be real careful about excess glue or it getting all over the place on you. All right, 19-inch circle. So now, Jenny, we need that whole pile of stuff. I'll get this one out of the way. This one. With the router, the plunge router. Alright, so this question was about cutting a 19-inch circle. I'm assuming we're making a frame because there was mention there of a piece of stained glass. So here's how I would do this. We want the outside of the circle to be nice, we want the inside of the circle to be nice, and we want the stained glass to drop into a rabbet. In this case, I'm working with a sheet of plywood, a partial sheet of plywood, but we could also do this by building a brick mold of solid wood to make up the frame. First thing we need to do is fasten our material down to a substrate. We're eventually going to cut all the way through, and if we don't fasten this down, it's going to get away from us. So this part I'm going to need help with, Ginny, because I can never get this peeled correctly. If you could be so kind as to peel the backer off the tape. Once it gets started, it goes great, but getting that paper started is always a pain. This is double-faced tape. It's not carpet tape. You can get this from woodworking stores. Gotta have it in the shop. Very, very useful, very versatile stuff. You're going to use it a lot once you have it. The board I've got on the bench is a piece of melamine, and that's just waste wood. You're going to see by our technique here that eventually we're going to cut into that, and that's just scrap that we would get rid of. Wow. All right. With the double face tape in place, we can flip and position it. Now, the key to this is a circle cutting jig for a router. This is pretty cool. This particular one is made by a company called Milescraft. There are other circle cutting jigs out there. This is just an example. The way this would work is that, let's take this Jenny, run the screw gun. Run the screw gun. Hey, this is live woodworking. And drive that screw right into the center point. Another lacy will play.
You put it on this.
I did. I put it on reverse just to mess you up. Nice. That gives my jig a place to pivot. Then the jig can go on to that pivot point like that. This is adjustable. That lets me set the radius and or diameter of my cut. Router goes into the base. Now notice that this is a plunge router. What that lets me do is enter the cut, and then I can pivot the whole assembly to make a first pass. I would do this in my 3/4 inch plywood here to get a nice cut. I'd probably do this in 3 passes, 3 different depths of cut. So what I would do is set my radius. Let's say we want to be nearly as big as the plywood, about there, lock that in place, plunge, then I would start this pivot that I just talked about. Come back, reset, deeper, another plunge, reset, another plunge. This is why we have to be on the sacrificial board, which needs to be clamped to our workbench, so it's not running away from us. We have to be on the sacrificial board because we're going to go all the way through this one. The double face tape has to be on there so that when we make that last cut and we freed up that outer ring, it doesn't jump into the router bit. It's locked in place. That's cut number 1. Then we're going to reduce the diameter by what we want as the width of our finished frame. Second verse, or maybe we're on the 4th verse by this point, same as the first. We're going to plunge, make a pass, plunge, make a pass, plunge, make a pass, until we've cut all the way through. Then I'm going to go back out. Now on this one, we're cutting the rabbet for the stained glass. So on this pass, we're going to plunge, but we're never going to go all the way through. We want to leave behind that shoulder so that it can receive the stained glass. What's really nice about this is that it's a nice, safe way to make a circle. And if we get Krista to come in close, this is a spiral router bit in here. And that spiral router bit is really a good way to do this. The spiral shape is going to help excavate dust out of the cut so it keeps it nice and clean. And the spiral shape, the spiral cutters, are going to leave a really, really good cut quality on the surface. So a router-based circle cutting jig with a plunge router and a spiral bit is a great way to do this. And like I said, this particular one is a Milescraft brand. If you Google it, you will find it online. All right, Bailey.
Cool. Thanks, George. Just a quick update. We are currently live streaming with Woodworkers Guild of America Managing Editor George Vondriska. He is answering all of your WWGOA questions. And George, speaking of, how do you feel about answering a live question that we just got posted?
A live question? Oh my gosh.
Well, it's about a tape saw. You there? Okay. Jason is wondering, what is a good method for dust proofing a table saw?
What is a good method for dust proofing? you don't have to sneak in. So this style, not brand, this style of saw, if you look at the base of it, it's called a cabinet saw. One of the benefits to cabinet saws is, oddly enough, it's a cabinet down here. So all the guts of the saw are inside that cabinet. Traditional cabinet saws like this are made that way. Also, what today are being called hybrid saws are made that way. So as a result, one dust port on the bottom of the saw. Is that better? One dust port on the bottom of the saw, and all the dust is doing a pretty good job of getting collected out of it. What's much harder to collect dust on are what are called contractor style saws. On a contractor saw, you'll know it because the motor is usually sticking out the back, and as a result, there's a very open assembly here. What I've seen some woodworkers do is to put baffles over those open areas and try to close them up. That's all good until you have to angle the blade, because when you need to angle the blade, the baffles are probably going to be in the way. So like I said, there's a lot of it depends here. What a lot of manufacturers are doing today that makes a lot of sense is, even on the contractor saws, they're putting shrouds right next to the blade, and that's where the dust collection comes in and connects. So that's a very effective way to get it. But again, on your older saws, what you might have to do is just try to rig baffles. Basically what we're doing is trying to close up all those outside areas so the dust doesn't have the opportunity to escape. There's no good one solution for it for every saw. Sorry.
That sounds good. Hey, while you're there, we have another live question about a table saw.
Uh-oh.
Atif wants to know, well, he's setting up a workshop in his shed, and he wants to know how much space he should keep behind the table saw.
How much space behind the table saw? So it's a good question, because it's not really behind the saw, it's also in front of the saw. So Ginny, why don't you get us grab a piece of oak off of that rolling stand, and we'll see if we can do this. This is a great question. I had to think about it a lot when I was setting up in here, and the question, or the answer to the question is, yeah, any one of the long ones, longer than that Cebu plate. Yeah, that.
Try that one.
That's really quick. Get them off the bottom shelf. What you have to ask yourself is, what are typically the longest boards that I'm going to cut? Now, this kind of goes back to the question we had earlier about having stuff on casters. She's so mad at having her go get it, she's going to poke me with it. Because what we have to have here is enough room on the infeed side to start the cut. And then we have to have, Ginny's going to catch, enough room on the outfeed side. Go. So right there, if we want to cut an 8-foot board, where that leaves us is that from a few inches in front of the blade, I got to have 8 feet behind me. From behind the blade, I've got to have 8 feet going that way. So cutting an 8-foot board means you need 18 feet of space available. Really good time to have casters on your table saw, so that if 90% of the time you're cutting short stuff, you can position the saw for that. But when needed, you can maybe open an outside door and handle that longer stuff, or move the saw as you need to handle the longer stuff.
Sounds good. Yeah, thanks for answering that. Well, let's get back to some of our submitted questions. Brett sent us an email earlier this week, and he's asking, in the absence of a jointer, what technique can be used with a different power tool to accomplish a similar jointer task?
Okay. This is a multi-part answer, and Krista, we're going to have you move like 400 times. So first come in toward the jointer is here on the router table. Now, the way a joiner works is that they've got an offset between the infeed table and the outfeed table. The outfeed table is set to be perfectly even with the top of the knives. The infeed table is just a little below that. That's what creates our cut. On some router tables, including this one, we can get, or they might come with, a shim that would get placed behind the outfeed fence. So as it sits here right now, this fence is perfectly straight across. Infeed to outfeed, one straight line. If I add that behind the outfeed fence, then there's a step, there's an offset. Like a joiner, I would make this fence even with the top of the rotation of my cutter. There's my offset. I can pass from this side to that side and join. If your router table doesn't have that capability, then we need a shop-made jig. It's the one for the next step. Oh, it's hanging on the wall, Jenny. Could you get it? It's the with the green laminate on it in front of your head. Not the really long one. Yep, the white and green one. Yep. So if your router table doesn't have that available, you can make one. This is a shop-made one, and for this, Krista, we can be like as much down here as you can get it. And what we've got going here is a melamine fence that was made in one piece. It's nice and straight from end to end. To get the jointer capability, I added a piece of plastic laminate only to the outfeed side. That creates the step, just like the spacer created the step in the first part of this, so that as we joint, we can have the offset we need here in order to make our cut. Now, as long as Krista's nice and tight there, can you see that router bit okay?
Yeah.
Okay. This is one of the cool things about jointing on a router table, is that we can put a spiral router bit in the table, and it's kind of all the rave these days is people want helical cutters on jointers, because helical cutters provide really, really good cut quality. The people in the shop are laughing at me. Okay.
That wouldn't be the first time you laughed at me.
It would not be the first time you laughed at me, that's correct. Helical cutters provide really good cut quality, especially in highly figured woods. So when we put that spiral router bit in the router table, we get really good cut quality from it. So even if you own a joiner, you might want to consider this, because if you're working with highly figured woods, or if you ever needed to edge joint man-made materials, then you could use the carbide router bit for that rather than use your steel jointer knives, because the man-made materials are often hard on tool steel knives. Now, we're not done with this question yet, but we got to make a move. We're going to go to the table saw next. Yep, that could go back. Now, on that answer, on that part of the answer, the router table part of it, if you look on the website, if you look at WWGOA.com, and you look at jointing on a router table, we've got an article where it talks about that, and it shows shop-made jigs to make that happen. We've also got this covered as an article. This is jointing on the table saw. Saw's unplugged, so I can show you some stuff here. This is a shop-made fence. It kind of straddles the blade about like that. As my material comes along, the blade takes a blade's width off. Our offset is here, so that on the outfeed side, the material starts riding on that part of the fence to allow it to keep going in a straight line. Between the two, I think you get a little better cut quality off the router table than you do off the table saw here, but this is another way that you can edge joint without a jointer. And again, that article, all of this build information for this jig is covered on WWGOA.com, and just search on there for jointing on a table saw, and you'll find that information.
Cool. Speaking of WWGOA, maybe we should mention we do have a promo code tonight, especially for our viewers. If you'd like to join to become a premium member, where you can get exclusive woodworking videos with George and other experts, we have a promo code for you, 50% off. It's WWGOA Live, all one word, all caps, and it's down in the description down below too. And just a quick update for you, George, we have almost 500 viewers watching tonight, so that's awesome. Getting in all of your questions, answering your woodworking questions. So let's go to the next one, yeah?
Hit it.
Next one's from Joe Alexander. He says, is there any downside in using a 7 1/4 blade for a 10-inch table saw other than reduced depth of cut?
All right, we're going to ask Krista to move back to the table saw. She's got to extend her extension cord a little. That's the clicking sound you hear. All right, so in this case, the question is about running a 7 1/4 inch, like a circular saw blade on the table saw, rather than a full-size blade. So, just saw's unplugged. Okay. Conventional blade, 10 inches in diameter. Question is it okay for me to do this instead? Here's one real easy way to look at this. If I put a dado head on my saw, they come in 2 sizes, either 8-inch or 6-inch. So that helps me decide right away that sure, it'd be okay to run a 7 1/4 inch diameter blade. If I can do the 6s and the 8s, shouldn't be any problem with that. Now, on this particular saw, which is a saw stop, because of the brake mechanism, you can do an 8-inch blade or a 10-inch blade. You can't do anything in between, otherwise the brake isn't going to operate. The saw won't allow itself to run. So on saws besides this, I don't see any downside in doing this except for a loss in capacity, which would be thickness capacity. With the conventional blade in here, fully extended, there's about 3 inches of depth, 3 inches depth of cut, 3 inches the maximum thickness. If I change to a 7 1/4, I got to do the math in my head. The difference is 2 3/4 inches in diameter, means 1 3/8 in the radius. So it's going to reduce my thickest board I can cut from 3 inches to 1 5/8 if I did my math right. So it will diminish how thick a board you can cut, but as far as the saw operating, shouldn't be a big deal.
Sounds good. Hey, just a quick note. It sounds like we did have some technical issues, George. We went blank for about 20 seconds or so, so just apologies to all the viewers out there. This is our first time using the live streaming technology, so working out the kinks, right?
Was it 20 good seconds or 20? But maybe it's good that we lost those 20 seconds.
Probably.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
All right, let's move on to the next question. Next one is from Ray. His question is related to thin kerf versus full kerf blades and the rip fence scale. He says that he has a Grizzly cabinet saw and a Weismeyer type rip fence. If he sets his scale to be very accurate with a full kerf blade, but when he installs the thin kerf blade, the scale is no longer accurate. Of course, he says it's a simple tape measure, but that sort of defeats the purpose of the scale. What do you think about that?
All right. Hey, guess what? We're going to move back to the table saw. All right, Jimmy, so you hold this toward Krista's camera. All right, so first off, let's hit this thick kerf, thin kerf. So, Krista, how close can you get us in profile on these two? You got them both?
Oh, probably pretty close.
Okay. And then the more dead on you can be, the easier that'll be.
Perfect. That is perfect.
Right. Hold still. Hold still. Hold still.
I'm holding still.
Okay. So what we've got going here are thick kerf and thin kerf. The yellow blade being a thin kerf blade, kerf being the slot that's made as we make a cut based on the size of the blade. A lot of people will go to the thin kerf blades to make cuts easier. Makes a lot of sense. We're removing less waste per pass, so it's easier to push the material past it. Additionally, there's just less waste. If you're cutting a real expensive material, a thin kerf blade is going to send less of that material up the dust chute. I like thin kerf blades, especially if I'm doing a lot of small rips from a board. If you think about it, you know, if we give up 1/8 of an inch, but it's an 8-inch rip, as a percentage, that's not much. If we give up 1/8 of an inch, but the rip is 3/4 of an inch, as a percentage, that's a lot of wood. Now what happens, okay, Ginny, What happens on the saw is that we decide what blade we're going to use, and then many table saws today have pointers or cursors on them so that I can calibrate the cursor to a tape measure here on the fence. Once I have that, instead of taking a reading between the blade and the fence, I can set that pointer, lock it in place, make the cut. So the question is about when you change from a thin curve to a standard curve, it changes the distance between the blade and the fence. As a result, the cursor loses its accuracy. What I do is I set the cursor to the blade that I'm going to have in the saw most of the time. Then, depending on the accuracy that I need to have in order to make the cut, I may or may not recalibrate. In other words, if I'm switching to a thin curve and the part I'm cutting could be plus or minus a 32nd or a 16th, then I don't care if I recalibrate my cursor. If the dimension is more critical than that, you got to take the time to do test cuts, recalibrate before you start making those critical cuts.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to throw another live question at you.
Live. All right.
Andy London, he commented down below, and he has a question for you. He says, what respirator would you recommend to use with CA glue and also with fine sanding? He's getting at odor versus particles.
Okay. So you've got two different things there. We've got like VOCs, which come off volatile organic compounds, which come off of liquids like CA glue, or what you need to do there is you need to wear the type of respirator you would wear if you were doing finishing. In fact, Jenny just experienced the finishing respirator. Why don't you grab that one? It's in the cabinet where all the finishes are, and we can show them that one. With that style respirator, a lot of times there's charcoal in the filters. I think it's in the cabinet under the mortiser, that big face shield that you wore that time. Nope, come back to me. Oh, never mind, you got it, you got it, you got it. There's charcoal or similar in the cans, and that's going to take those VOCs out of the air. So this style that Jeannie's got on, what's nice about this is in addition to protecting your nose, because we're breathing through these cans in order to get fresh air in, this entire environment inside here is also protected. So you're not going to get any fumes going into your eyes. So for stuff, anything that's given off a fume, we want something like this. For fine dust, something like a dust mask, it's just going to depend here on how far you want to go with this. The typical dust mask, Ginny, if you grab one of those right next to the drill press, those dust masks work fine, and I didn't wear one for a long time because, as many of you may know, not that long ago I had a full beard, and with a beard, when you put these on, Ginny's coming back, when you put these on, if you've got a beard, they don't seal against your face. So in my case, I got that Trend Air Shield that we looked at earlier tonight, and that provided the respiration protection I needed for fine dust. On these, you do want to be sure that you're using it correctly, which includes pinching this metal band closed against the bridge of your nose. That's part of what makes sure you have a real good seal. Oh, not that kind of seal. A seal on your nose.
Sounds like a seal of poop.
Thank you. Very good.
Very witty, George. All right, next question for you is from Gary. He says, I buy 4x4 lumber, and at times when trying to make parts, there are slight bows or twists to the wood. He's essentially wondering if he should instead buy a 5x4, which costs more and could get more shavings on the floor, if he should just stick with the 4x4.
Oh, okay. 4/4 Bailey, I think is what he means. So, it's 4/4, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, in the world of jargon, in hardwoods, we refer to 1-inch material, thick, being 4/4. 1 1/4 is 5/4. So, what most people will do is allow about 1/4 inch for cleaning up the material, getting it smooth, flat, straight, square, to get it down to their final size. So if you want 3/4 inch stock, you should be able to get 4/4 lumber and bring it down to the 3/4 inch that you need. I would only buy 5/4 if I needed full 1 inch in my project. And part of that is the timeliness in which you start to do those machining operations. If you're buying it rough sawn, a full 1 inch thick, you should leave it rough until you're ready to use it for a project. Because what will happen is, as it sits there, it might get some cups and some twists in it. If it's still 1 inch thick, you can take those out when you take it down to 3/4. If it's already down to 3/4 and it sits and sits and sits and sits in your shop, and then it develops a cup or a twist, there's very little room left in the thickness in order to remove wood to make it okay, to make it smooth, flat, straight, square. So leave it full thickness until you're ready to use it for a project. In that vein, be sure that when it's coming into your shop, you're giving it a chance to acclimate. In this part of the country, what was our coldest part of winter? It was like 28, 30 below, right?
Very cold.
Very cold. So if the material is stored someplace where it's cold, it needs to come in the shop here and acclimate for 2 or 3 days before you're going to work with it. Then you can start all those machining operations.
Sounds good. Hey, George, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to throw a couple more at you, maybe do a couple more live, and then we'll wrap this up. Our next question for you is from Jerry. He has a cypress fresh cut log, 8 foot by 8 or 8 foot long, 8 inches. And he wants to try to make something out of it, but he's never worked with this kind of wood. What do you suggest? Cutting it or letting it dry?
Okay, that's a good question. Jenny, could you get over by the scroll saws? There's a big walnut cookie, and it's got, I think it's got lines drawn on it. So I get this question a lot, which is, yep, I want to turn logs into lumber, so do I let the log dry or do I let the lumber dry? And the cookie that Ginny is bringing us is a good example of why we let lumber dry, not logs. Look at beautiful walnut tree this was. Look at that check in there, that crack. What's going to happen if we allow logs to dry is they're going to start to crack like this. And part of the dealio with that is that the pith and the heartwood and the sapwood have slightly different densities to the cells. So as a result, when they start to shrink from the drying process, they shrink a little bit differently. That's what causes, part of what causes cracks to happen. So the lines on this particular log represent plane sawing versus quarter sawing. It's a whole different lesson. So we don't have lines? So what we really want to do is we want to take your cypress log, and I'd love to have your cypress log, by the way, that sounds cool, and machine that into planks, then let the planks dry. Once they're dry, then turn them into a project. So it's never effective to let wood dry as a log. You want to mill it out first.
Sounds good. Another question for you from Noel. He says, for the home woodworker or DIY type guy, what is a reasonable tolerance for measurements in woodworking?
Plus or minus 4 inches, Noel, is going to be fine. No, so here's the reality check on that is I worked in a tool shop, and I'm familiar with the whole thousandths of an inch gig. But it really doesn't lend itself to what we're trying to do with wood that's going to undergo seasonal movement and make all of these changes from winter to summer that wood typically does. So part of the lesson I try to teach woodworkers is that often accuracy is, going to say it, I'm already saying it backwards, live woodworking. Consistency is often more important than accuracy, meaning that what I really try to teach people to do is make sure that when you're cutting, every part that's supposed to be the same is the same. If it's even 1/16 of an inch too long, in most cases, not in every case, it's probably still going to be okay. Now, of course, there are exceptions to the rule. An inset drawer front has to be exactly the right size to fit in. But if we're making a table and it's got 2 long rails and 2 short rails, and we miss those dimensions by just a little bit, as long as the 2 long ones are the same, the 2 short ones are the same, all 4 legs are the same, you're going to be okay. And you're going to be a happier woodworker if you cut yourself a break. Now, I'm not saying plus or minus 1/16. I guess I'm saying plus or minus a 32nd, which in thousandths is about 30 thousandths of an inch. But really, my lesson out of this is try to make sure that everything is very, very consistent.
That sounds good. I think we have a couple more times, or a couple more minutes for some more questions. Vinny wants to know, his woodworking tools have been in storage for quite a while, and they've developed some rust on the top. He wants to know the best way to remove the rust and renew the surfaces to a factory finish.
All right, we're going to look at the table saw again for that. We need stuff, Jenny. Put your gloves on, please. All right, so my table saw is not rusty, although it's got some spots on it. So the first thing I'm going to do is spray the surface with a rust remover. So this is just liquid wrench. Get this at an auto parts store, get it at a home center, and what we're trying to make happen here is just something that would cut the rust on the surface here. And Jenny, I'm going to get you a sanding block. So hang on just a moment. And then wrap your sandpaper around this, because what I want to do is I want to make sure that the sanding I do doesn't have any negative effect on the flatness of the surface. So go ahead and elbow grease it. Go ahead, sand away. And that's why I wrap the sandpaper around that sanding block. This is a 500 grit sandpaper. Wet dry sandpaper would be a great choice for this application because we are wet sanding. So let's see, I'm going to get some paper towels. All right, give that a stop. All right, it might be a little hard to see under these lighting conditions, but this did have an effect, a positive effect. I've done the same technique on stuff where a ceiling leaked and water dripped from the ceiling and left huge rust stains on the table. It'll take longer, but this will clean it up. Next step, wipe this down with mineral spirits or another solvent to get all the junk off of there. Next step after that, to prevent this from happening again, look for, am I in the right spot with this, Krista, for that product? We want to look for woodworking specific lubricants. The key to this kind of stuff is that there's no silicone in it. We don't want any silicone on the surface that can migrate into your material and then prevent finish from sticking to it later. So make sure you're looking for the right product. This particular product, this Glide Coat, you can buy it on Amazon. It used to be called Top Coat, different name. All right.
Sounds good. Well, George, one last question for you that was submitted live tonight.
Okay.
Jason wants to know, how did you get started in woodworking?
How did I get started? Well, I feel like I've told this story so many times, but I'll tell it again. When I was in 6th grade in North Riverside, Illinois.
And was that before World War I? I'm sorry, did you?
So anyway, when I was in 6th grade, I had a shop teacher, Bill Mathis, at Hauser Junior High down in Illinois, and he was a really good shop teacher. And my dad had died when I was little. My dad died when I was 6. So Bill Mathis was a real nice guy, and I just really glommed onto him. And at some point, maybe in 7th grade or so, I decided I wanted to be just like Bill Mathis when I grew up. Asked him how he became a shop teacher. He told me he went to UW Stout, University of Wisconsin Stout. So from that moment on, I took every shop class I could take. I did a lot of putsy little woodworking at my house. A neighbor gave me a Dunlap scroll saw when I was 12. I had a lathe when I was 13. I did whatever I could on my own at my mom's house. I went to school to be a tech ed teacher. Did a little bit of conventional shop teaching, but primarily started teaching adults. And that's really what got me where I am today. Now, Bailey, don't shut us down yet. Open it up, Ginny. Ginny's dying to show off, and I don't blame her. Some of you have followed this either via Facebook or YouTube or both, but this is Ginny's finished guitar that she made. And there are 3 videos about this, so you can catch up with those. If you just go on WWGOA.com and search guitar, there's videos that were shot along the way. but give them the 30,000-foot view. What's the main body wood again?
African limba.
African black limba and body style. We always mess this up. Firebird or Thunderbird?
It's not Thunderbird.
It's a Firebird. Okay. Got a plan. Ginny did most of the work herself and just plucked the strings because it's cool. All right, Bailey, now you can do with us whatever. Did you enjoy the process? I'll ask you that.
I did enjoy the process.
Okay, and working with, your dad.
Well,
Not that part.
it was fun.
Okay. All right, Bailey.
That's beautiful. Great job.
Thank you.
Well, we're at the end of our time. Do you guys have any parting words of wisdom for us?
Well, I think this was cool, and I think, again, for people who didn't get their questions answered now, watch Ask WWGOA as a regular column on WWGOA.com. Look there for your question and an answer. Additionally, if the powers that be think this went well enough, we'll do it again. So we might then bring your question to the next session we do with this. If you have suggestions about what we should do, we want to know what we could do to make it bigger, better, faster, stronger. And anything from you, Jenny? You want to tell the 8 million people who are tuned in right now watching this?
I can't think of any puns right now.
Can't think of any puns. Why don't you tell them who should not be woodworkers? My all-time favorite woodworking joke.
Oh, God. Is this that pediatrician
Yeah.
thing?
Why don't pediatricians make good woodworkers?
Because they have no patience?
They have very little patience. Oh, her opportunity for startup.
I
She messed
tried.
up the punchline. My favorite woodworking joke. All right, Bailey. That's
Good one.
in that very bad form of humor. I think Jenny and Krista behind the camera and I are. Oh, and Shiva the bench dog is here, but she's been sleeping the whole time. There she's. Okay. So the four of us are ready to sign off and say, as Mr. Mathis used to say, get out in the shop and make chips, boys.
Just what is
That sounds great. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye.
Thanks for watching.